Good afternoon, everyone who has joined us watching live on videocast. We are looking forward to our next hour together as we celebrate and kick off the 2021 Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders Heritage Month here at the National Institutes of Health. If you are here for the Conversations with AAPI Leaders event, then you're in the right place. We welcome all of you, from those of you from NIH to the other HHS sister agencies, to those from across the federal government and from the community. My name is Caroline Goon, and I am not only thrilled to have the opportunity to kick off today's event, but I am also a strategist for the Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders portfolio here at NIH in the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Along with my talented colleagues from the NIH chapter of the Federal Asian Pacific American Council, known as NIH FAPAC, today's event is incredibly meaningful to the AAPI community because the importance of visible role models for the next generation cannot be understated. And we now have an advantage in seeing individuals like our panelists, Dr. Noni Burns, Dr. Michael Chiang, and Dr. Rina Vizuzan with us today. With that said, it is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Lawrence Tabak, Principal Deputy Director at the National Institutes of Health, who will grace us for the next few minutes and share some of his thoughts before our panelists take over. Dr. Tabak previously served as the Acting Principal Deputy Director of NIH in 2009, and prior to that, he was the Director of the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research from 2000 to 2010. Dr. Tabak's leadership demonstrates what allyship amongst and to our various communities looks like. He is an example to those in the AAPI community and beyond, and has also demonstrated his commitment to empowering the next generation of leadership. Dr. Tabak, we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thanks so very much, Caroline. It's really a pleasure to be here. First, I want to thank the leaders of the NIH Federal Asian Pacific American Council for inviting me. This event always provides a really good time for us to gather and to learn from one another and frankly to reflect on what's been going on during the past year. Well, it's been quite a past year. We're living through the nexus of the COVID-19 pandemic and the highly regrettable polarization of our nation. A tragic symptom of this tension is a deplorable increase in acts of violence and intolerance towards AAPI communities. Witnessing acts of violence against our brothers and sisters from these communities is heartbreaking, and it is utterly unacceptable. Respect for all persons of all ethnicities and races, of all sexual orientations, of all religious beliefs. This is a fundamental ethical principle and one that we hold very strongly to at NIH. It's one of the reasons why we recently launched Unite, which is an NIH-wide initiative to end structural racism here and within the biomedical research enterprise at large. What's happening in our nation now harms every single one of us, both short-term and long-term. As we've recognized with our Unite efforts, the biomedical research enterprise is powered by people committed to scientific advancement and innovation to improve human health and reduce the burden of disease for all. NIH is committed to breaking down the barriers that prevent the full breadth of talent from contributing to the biomedical enterprise. This enterprise is strengthened when it harnesses the complete intellectual capital of the nation, bringing diverse perspectives, backgrounds, and skill sets to apply to complex problems. As we celebrate Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month this year, the leaders at FAPAC shared the 2021 theme, Advancing Leaders Through Purpose-Driven Science. I believe our Unite initiative aligns well with the theme And the emphasis is certainly perfect for the conversation today because employees and leaders who are driven by purpose understand that they can make a difference by serving others more than themselves. The tradition of senior level investigators training and mentoring the next generation of leaders in research is one of NIH's most valuable and valued principles. I'm sure most of us can reflect on our own careers and recall taking advantage of words of advice or caution from someone who took the time to reach out and point out pitfalls or show us an avenue we perhaps had not considered. And so, at the risk of providing you all with unasked for advice, I'm going to offer 3 important things that I've learned in my now 40 plus year scientific career. The first is, do not be afraid to fail. If you've never failed, you've probably not taken sufficient intellectual risks. When I interview potential staff, I always ask if they've ever failed at anything. I get very nervous if the answer is no, I've never failed anything. Second, although all of you are high achievers, accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, you don't have to be in order to succeed. It's far more important to simply make sure that you're always in a room with smart people. And that's something that I've lived and breathed for the last 21 years here at NIH. And finally, you need to put into practice being a mensch. Mensch is the Yiddish expression for a good person who offers help to those in need without any expectation of return. The 3 outstanding leaders you're going to hear from today are highly successful in their own careers, but also they are highly successful as mentors. I encourage you to listen to their stories and their advice. And if you have some time later, I also encourage you to visit the NIH AAPI campaign via the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion website. The campaign showcases ways we are honoring and celebrating our colleagues. And now I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Christina Wu, Chief of the Biomedical Technology Branch at the National Institute of General Medical Sciences, who will be the panel moderator today. Dr. Wu.
Thanks, Dr. Tabak, for the opening remarks. As we all know, the AAPIs are perceived as model citizens and worker bees. Based on an ascent analysis of 2018 government data, while Asians are more likely than members of other ethnic groups to be found in professional jobs and have college degrees, their numbers drop off at the executive level. Similarly, in the tech sector, while Asian Americans work in large numbers, the numbers of AAPI at senior level management drop. With this in mind, did you know that we have 3 AAPI Institute directors at NIH before seeing our meeting flyer? It is my honor and distinct pleasure on behalf of NIH FAPAC chapter to introduce the 3 AAPI Institute directors to showcase what NIH has achieved in the area of this diversity in leadership. They will share with us their personal experiences and tips on leadership and empowerment for the next generation. As I introduce the panelists, I will not elaborate on their stellar scientific success and resume. Instead, I will give each panelist a few minutes to share their background about their life, about their family and education, and what led them to NIH. We'd like to understand a little about what has shaped their perspective. So our first panelist is Dr. John Bern, Director of the Center for Scientific Review at NIH. She leads a staff of more than 500 scientific support and contract personnel and is responsible for overseeing a majority of NIH peer review process. She has a background in chemistry and analytical chemistry and worked in the pharmaceutical industry before joining the NIH. Dr. Bern, would you mind sharing your personal journey?
Hi, Christina. Thank you, and thank you for the chance to participate in this distinguished panel. I'll make it brief because I know that we have a long session and a rich session ahead of us. I'll simply say that I grew up in Pakistan, in the city of Karachi, and I came to the US at age 18 to go to college. I stayed for graduate school. Some of it you've already heard from Christina. Worked in the pharmaceutical industry and preclinical and clinical drug development. I came to the NIH actually directly to CSR to take on a new review committee that was forming in those days in the area of bioanalytical technology development. It was a really good fit for my training and background, and it was a brand new growing area for NIH at the time. Of course, now it's a very big part of many institutes' portfolios. So I've been here now for 20 years and looking forward to several more. So I'll let my colleagues take on.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Bern. Our next panelist is Dr. Michael Chiang, who is the director of National Eye Institute at NIH. He was a practicing clinical ophthalmologist and is a board-certified clinical informatician. He has a background in electrical engineering, biology, and biomedical informatics. Dr. Chiang, would you mind sharing your personal journey?
Christina, thanks. And thanks to you and Caroline for really organizing this. I guess I would just say that my parents came to this country from Taiwan in the late 60s, and I was born in Pittsburgh and raised in Detroit, Michigan, because my dad was an automotive engineer at Ford Motor Company. And almost everybody in my family was an engineer. And so I studied electrical engineering when I went to college. And for a number of reasons, decided that I actually wanted to go to medical school because I wanted to develop technologies that could be used to take, basically better care of people. Ended up becoming an ophthalmologist for various reasons. And, just basically have tried to build a career working at the intersection of healthcare and information technology. I spent the first 9 years of my career working at Columbia University. So it's, sort of the opposite of Noni. I just got here. And, so 9 years in New York City, 10 years at Oregon Health and Science University in Portland. And for the last 2 years, I was promoted into a position where I was helping to run the ophthalmology department there. And so basically, like I said, I've been here for about 5 months. And, as a kid, I never imagined that I'd grow up and be somebody who would end up wanting to take a leadership position. And, certainly not in the government. But, I would say that the reason that I'm here is that throughout my career, I've really seen the, let's say impact, that we can make. When you come up with ideas and try to inspire other people to believe in them and try to motivate everyone to work together. I think that for all of us, what motivates us is that, we love doing what we do and want to make a difference in the world. And for me, that's kind of what drew me into this kind of position. So thanks, Christina.
Thank you, Dr. Chiang. Our third panel member is Dr. Rina Vizuzan. She is the director of the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research at NIH. She was trained in dental surgery and is a licensed dentist. Dr. D'Souza, would you mind sharing your personal journey? Rina, unmute yourself.
Oh, I am delighted to be among a distinguished panel of colleagues, and thank you, Christina and Caroline and Jinji, for all your efforts in bringing this together. Very timely manner, I think, very important. I also want to actually reach out, if I was there, to give each of us a hug that have experienced hardships in the last year and a half. To my Chinese and Korean colleagues, especially so, And now in India, with the crisis and COVID, with so many having family and friends affected by this. So I want to personally say how much all of that means to me personally, and how important it is for us to support each other in this time. So in terms of how to tell you more about myself from a professional angle, I would say that I have pursued discovery science, and as Larry, who is a mentor and a role model for me in many ways, giving back in the form of mentorship and dissemination has always been a very important balance for my career. When you look at your various roles that you play, I'm the proud mother of two kids, and I'm proud of them because they're loving and compassionate children, and that's the best you can wish for your kids, to be socially responsible and caring. And I'm married to a Richard who for 40 plus years, who has enjoyed a very successful career, which meant that he kept me strapped down to Texas for many years, a conservative state, and Utah after was my decision to move there to pursue a deanship there. I would say if I had to package myself into short descriptors, I love life, I love people, I love good food, music. I enjoy yoga and Pilates, and I try to use these pursuits to balance my professional life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vizuzan. Great. So now we know more about our panelists. We can begin our conversation. We're still with Dr. Vizuzan. Rina, would you tell us about barriers to overcome in your life journey, and what are the issues you face as a supervisor or leader?
Okay, well, I'm glad you used the word journey, because it is a journey. It's not a destination, right? And when I was talking to the women of color last week about that academic journey, I couldn't help but think of the astrological calendar that defines our personal cycles and professional growth periods in terms of 30-year spans. And that really is defined by the time Saturn actually takes to rotate around all the planets. Now, I'm not a big believer in astrology, but I did pay attention to that because I do feel that every 30 years that my life has, in that transition period from first cycle to second cycle, that the world kind of turned on me. And so I was born in Bombay, came to the US, and obviously had to start from Columbia University, moved to Houston, a new life, entirely newly married, had my children at the same time I was pursuing my graduate studies. So through my life journeys in Texas and in Utah, as I kind of worked in the trenches to develop excellence, I know now, as I look back, that those first 30 years and even the beginning of the second cycle, I was pretty clueless. I was clueless about the effect I had on others around me, or the effect of others on me was very oftentimes misunderstood as I climbed up the ladder of inference to jump to conclusions, when most often I was wrong in concluding them, right? So I've learned lots of lessons in life that I'm not saying that I'm ready to teach them to others, but I certainly would like to share them. And one of them is about running up the ladder of inference, trying to develop a more proactive stance rather than a reactive stance, so that because things that frustrate you as a Asian American or Pacific Islander, subtle cues of exclusion that you pick up. I have to deal with questions even till today is, where are you from? Your accent is so different. And initially that used to irritate me, but I think now I've interpreted that in a positive light and can answer that correctly without getting angry about it. And because it meant that I wasn't seen as someone that belonged, right? So I think that's really important, being able to, and I'm translating every one of my experiences into the lesson that I learned, to be able to look at a situation through multiple sets of lenses, understanding the other side, especially when you're in a conflict yourself or you're trying to resolve it for others, that you really have that opportunity to see things from another's perspective, I think really helps you navigate difficult paths. What I struggle with, I don't think it's a struggle as much as the responsibility one bears. So say Michael and I are probably the first Asian Americans in our positions at NIH. Now one can stop and feel very good about it, but what it does carry with it is that onus of responsibility that you are in fact a role model for many. Consciously, unconsciously, you represent that in fact you transcended a glass ceiling or two. And so I think that bears upon me. I take it very seriously, that particular role. And as Larry mentioned, giving back, when you get to the stage, when you give back more than you can receive for yourself, it's when you feel you can make a difference. And so I think the issues of threatening others around me and other kinds of things that I've learned to navigate no longer are major issues for me today. It's more trying to make the difference, to realize that we are all born with a sense of purpose, to be able to recognize that we are unique individuals and that our time on this earth is small, actually, and that if we can use it to become the person that you were meant to be, then it is a journey that is well spent. So I would say that would be my answer to that question. I hope it's adequate.
Thank you, Rina.
Thank you.
Thank you. Noni or Mike, would you like to share your experience? How about Noni first?
Oh, okay. What barriers? I guess that's the question, right? What barriers have I overcome? You know, I have some perspective. Because I think my barriers were mostly cultural barriers at home, right? I mean, I grew up in a middle class family in Pakistan, and my parents were very educated. My mother was a principal of a school, but there were some significant traditional expectations of what my future would look like, and that I would become a medical doctor, that I would have an arranged marriage and have that be done by age 22. So I think I had some of that, and I think I would think of it more as a challenge than a barrier that continued, and because that didn't work out because I still cannot stand the sight of blood, and I had zero interest in marriage, so that became clear that wasn't going to happen. I wanted to study science. I wanted to come to the US, and I liked chemistry. My brothers were educated abroad in the US and the UK, but my sister had that arranged marriage, and so that was the expectation. And my mother especially had that, because I think at least in the Pakistani community, the community value matters, what people think, and that was really important to her. Fortunately for me, my father was sort of marched to the beat of his own drum and thought girls should have the same educational opportunities, and supported my plans to move here. So I think to some extent that challenge continued while I went through graduate school, because every opportunity, every time I went back, there was some level of pressure to, okay, I think you've done enough. Why don't you stay and get married? So I think I encountered more of the barriers back then than I did later. Also, I think I got perspective because I actually trained in the lab of a prominent African-American scientist, and I saw the very significant barriers that he faced, even though he was quite distinguished and published. And so I feel like my experiences are pretty minimal in the US compared to what I saw there. I'll leave it at that and let Michael jump in.
Well, Noni and Rina, I think the things that you said, many of them really resonated with my life experience. And I guess the benefit of going third is that I get to think about what I'm going to say in the context of what you said and try to. I guess I would say, number one, that I feel pretty fortunate in life, all things considered. I'm a little bit embarrassed to talk about barriers. But I also think, all of us have barriers in life. And I really have tried to adopt the philosophy, and I think this, this is kind of what you're saying, that it's sort of how we face those barriers that really defines, who we are. And so I guess I'm going to focus my answer to barriers on an Asian American Pacific Islander bent, and just say that, I think growing up in Detroit in the 1980s was probably one of the most difficult places in the country to grow up for Asian children. Like, the population in the suburbs was basically 100% white, very conservative. And, I think at the time there was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment. I mean, some of it was covert, and I think some of it was pretty overt. Like, Detroit is an automotive town, and it's very heavily unionized. And there was enormous, what I would say is particularly anti-Japanese sentiment at the time, because companies like Toyota and Honda were succeeding, and they were taking business away from our auto industry. And so that was the setting where Vincent Chin was killed by 2 auto workers in the early 1980s. And so I would say that I kind of dealt with that in, I'd say 2 ways. One of them was to try to fit in. When you're a boy, you fit in by playing sports. And I always played a lot of sports as a kid. And another way that kids, I think, fit in general is that they talk. And I kind of learned to be talkative, and got the lead role in our school's 5th grade play, and just kind of learned to use humor to relieve stress. But I would say another way that I dealt with that was just to sort of learn that it was okay to be different. In some ways, my family was always different from the families of my friends, and some of the things were completely trivial. Like, when we came into the house, we took our shoes off, and everybody else left their shoes on. And I used to think I was weird because we were the only one that behaved a certain way. But as I got older, I started to think, well, it's a little bit dirty to not to leave them on, and so it's little subtle things like that, I think, were empowering to me as I got older. And I always felt like, well, it's okay to be a little bit different. And as a scientist whose job was to you're always at the border of the known and the unknown, and it's sometimes it's better to be a little bit different. I actually think that served me pretty well in the long term. So I guess, Christina, I'm just going to speak briefly to the second part of your question, which is about leadership and supervisory roles. That I do think that, as both Rina and Noni said, that I do think that there's a lot of implicit bias in the world. And as a Asian American Pacific Islander, I think people expect you to be quiet. And my wife is a pediatrician, and for so many of her medical school evaluations, she got a line saying that she was quietly competent. And when she compared with all the other Asian Americans in her class, they all got the same line, as if it was just sort of copied on every Asian American woman in particular. And I think that's something that I've struggled with. That's something that all of us, kind of do. And as a junior faculty member at Columbia, I just mentally said to myself, well, gosh, at every talk that I'm listening to in the audience, I'm going to ask a question to try to make sure that I sort of establish that presence, because that's how people get to know you. And Christina, I do agree with you that I do think that there's a bias there that Asians are perceived as sort of workers rather than leaders. But I guess I would just sum up by saying that, yeah, I do think that, what I'm hearing is that we're all sort of saying very different, very similar, sort of different aspects of what's a very similar sort of general ideas. And I think that it's really been interesting for me to listen to how we've all sort of, dealt with them and moved forward.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, this is very interesting responses. Okay, so let's move on to the second question. So the second question is related to the current situation. So in this stressful time, how do you address the increase in violence and harassment against the AAPI community with your teams and colleagues? Noni, do you want to give it a try first?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me just say that, NIH is blessed to have, a really large, very strong, talented, and trusted AAPI community that has made so many and continues to make so many contributions to our mission and to our success. I think this rhetoric against Asian Americans appears to have grown more and more what I would call venomous in the last few years, and in the last year reached just a level that was unprecedented. And then there's the violence, in Atlanta and across the nation. And it's a really, really sad example of the ignorance and racism that still prevails, unfortunately, in this country. How do we address it with our teams? I think the first thing to do is to acknowledge it, to shine a light on it, and call it out and name it for what it is, which is just racism, right? So I think that's important as leaders, as supervisors, even as members of teams to do that. It's really important to do that. The other thing is to, we have to acknowledge the impact of all of this that's going on those in the AAPI community who are in our teams, right? They're hearing the news, your family's worried about other family members. There's this experiencing the fear of violence. All the time, you still also have to do the job. You also have to show up at a meeting and get that report and have that smile on your face. And I think we have to recognize the impact of all that's going on around them on our staff who are from these communities, and offer them support. NIH has resources, but I think just offering the space to listen is important. And the final thing, I think actually it's important to provide an opportunity for AAPI staff to provide us with tangible feedback on what we can do to improve the environment for them in our own workplaces. Because it's really hard to tackle what's happening in the entire country. It seems like an overwhelming problem that can spiral you into depression, but having sort of controlled areas where you can have an impact and providing those opportunities, I think, is important. So.
Mike and Rina, you want to add more to Noni's response? Rina?
Okay? Well, I think Noni's captured it all. Calling it out is important and in a timely manner. So when the announcement came of the Atlanta shootings, and this is my personal reaction, we were, the very next morning, we were at an ICD meeting, the early morning Thursday meetings, and I was waiting for Dr. Collins to say something. Obviously, he was crafting his statement and didn't say anything. Because of that, I would think. But I wrote to Marie Bernard and said, I really would expect a statement of solidarity and support for the Asian community at that time. So I did that, and then we sent out an email message to everyone at NIDCR. And my lab is still in Utah, and I reached out to them as well. And there was a lot of fear and anxiety that if you translate that to your own family and your safety of your children or your aged parents, that really hit me very hard. And so now, because we're in a virtual age, and I took on the directorship in this virtual era we're living in, I created these coffee chat sessions where every 2 weeks, totally voluntarily, people sign up to just get to know the director and me getting to know them, and them getting to know each other. So it turned out to be much more effective and significant than I myself had projected. And I'm going to use one of these coffee hours to actually, by invitation, but also totally a voluntary thing, to reach out to our Asian American staff so that we can talk and find ways to support each other as needed. I feel the importance of Unite, and I want everyone who's listening in to really put your heart and soul into it. It's not directed against one particular racial or ethnic minority. It's really meant to create a universally inclusive community that is both equitable and diverse. So please do get involved, become involved if you're not already. And so that's really what I have to say to support what Noni just mentioned. Thank you.
Mike, do you want to add more to the response?
Yeah, I would go further and say that, again, Noni and Rina, I basically agree with every single thing you guys said. And Noni, to follow up on one thing you had said, well, both of you had said about mutual understanding. I remember thinking that after the Atlanta shootings, there was a policeman in Atlanta who was recorded as to making a comment that the shooter had a bad day. And, I thought that was a very odd comment. And, there's a lot of politics behind that. But what really, one of the things that struck me about that is that, I thought that, well, no wonder Black people are so frustrated in some ways at the way they've been treated over years. And I felt like that gave me a little bit of a different appreciation for what a different group felt about it. And I hope that it's things like that that give us as a NIH-wide community a little bit better perspective that we all have issues and challenges as groups, and sometimes understanding one person's, like having our own challenges, can give us better insight on what other people are going through. Because I do think that it's important to reinforce to this community that we're all in this together. Another thing I would say that, Rina, you made a comment that sometimes people will ask you about, your English and where did you come from? And I would say that for me, I have a different perspective on that I'll speak classic sort of Midwestern English, and I'll hear a different version of that, which is, oh, your English is so good. How did you learn? And they're completely well-meaning comments, but I think that the obvious, to me, the underlying issue is that I do think that Asians in this country are often perceived as outsiders. And that, regardless of how long you've been here, there's a little bit of it. And I hope that one message to the AAPI community at NIH is just sort of following on what both of you said, is that, I do think that the contributions to NIH and to American society overall are really highly valued. And that, I think it's important that, Asians are Americans, just like everybody else in this country. And, to get to the anti-AAPI, and it's, clearly, to me, sort of an analogy is anti-Muslim sentiment after 9/11. We moved to New York City 2 months before September 11th and sort of lived through that. And instantly, my wife's closest friend in Oregon is ethnically Indian, and her daughters would get harassed every September 11th, because you caused this problem. And I think that one message for colleagues is that, I think that what happened in one region of the world doesn't really reflect, on people around the world who kind of look, have the same skin color. And I think that's important to get across. I think one other issue that I think is important is that with regard to the science of COVID, I think that one, there are a lot of political issues, obviously, but one contribution that I think is sometimes overlooked is that the genetic sequence of the virus was actually published to a public website by scientists in China. And that was one reason that we were able to develop vaccines so quickly. And as an ophthalmologist, I recognize that one of the early so-called whistleblowers was an ophthalmologist who was in China, who raised some of the public awareness. And I think that's a message that people like Francis and Tony Fauci and Larry have been promoting on a national level. And I would love to hear sort of feedback from the audience about what everyone's level of comfort is in this environment, and are we sort of promoting this message enough? And sort of where are we? But I think these are really important issues. And Christina, glad you asked.
Thank you. And not to we have to not to diminish. I mean, a lot of frontline workers are Asian. Doctors and nurses, we are Asian people. So we contribute a lot in this COVID crisis. Okay, so thank you. So the third question is related to fostering the next generation AAPI. What is your advice to the next generation AAPI who wants to become leader? How can AAPI parents foster their next generation in achieving their goal? Mike, you get to take it first.
Yeah, Christina, it's a great question. Mentorship. I obviously, the comment that Larry and Rina made at the very beginning. I think mentorship is extremely important. I've been really fortunate in my career to have extraordinary mentors who've totally changed the course of my career and really my life. And most of my mentors have not been Asian, and that's just a statistical thing, and just because of the numbers. But my first department chair at Columbia University was ethnically Chinese. His name is Stanley Chang, and he was actually born in China, but really raised in the U.S. from when he was very, very young. And so I think he was a great mentor and a great role model. And I definitely agree with what specifically Rina said earlier, that it makes a difference, I think, for that next generation to seek out role models. This sort of like the Nonis and the Rinas out there who really understand firsthand what some of those unique challenges for Asian Americans may be. In terms of fostering that next generation, Christina, I think that there are a lot of laudable goals that people can have, and leadership is one of them, but it's not the only one. What I tell my kids is that the most important thing for you to do is figure out what you're passionate about, and then to go and try to do that. And Rina, I love what you said, that the most important thing in your kids that you're proud of is that they're compassionate, people. And just as a quick little anecdote, if I may, when I was in high school, my dad and my uncle, the two of them both actually had very high management positions in engineering companies. They always used to ask me, well, why don't you run for class president? And Stanley Chang, my first chair, used to always say to me, Mike, you're going to become department chair someday. And I would always respond, I don't want to be class president, and I really don't want to be department chair. I just want to focus on doing those things that are interesting to me. And it's interesting that throughout my career, doing those things naturally led to a leadership position, but it really would have been fine if they didn't. I guess the last thing I would say in terms of the class president business is that I have two daughters, and their ages 15 and 19 right now. And when the older one was in high school, one day she came home from school and said, I want to run for class president. And I thought that was fascinating, because it just thought, well, maybe there is some sort of optimism for the future. And maybe one of the things that comes out of this is that I think it would be great if there's a younger of people within this community who ends up becoming interested in public policy and service.
Thank you. Noni, do you have something to add?
Yeah, so I actually resonate a lot with what Michael just said. And I guess, maybe you asked about advice to the next generation of AAPIs who want to be leaders. And I guess my advice would be to follow your heart, right? Leadership I don't think leadership is a position. I think leadership can be exercised wherever you are. That's not the same as getting sort of promoted. And I don't know if the question related to getting promoted, but I would consider my father a leader, even though he actually had a pretty, I would say, lower level position in the government of Pakistan. We were not rich, but I think he marched to the beat of his own drum, and he did what he cared about. I think that is ultimately what matters and what makes you happy. So I would say do something that you love and you believe in. You can lead by being different, which I think, at least from the Asian community that I come from, is a big thing, to be different. Different could just be, I'm going to study the classics rather than go into science or engineering, right? I mean, so I think I would advise that the AAPI next generation that want to become leaders just pursue their passion. wherever they are. So, and then I guess the parent question, I completely agree. I think our role as parent is to just, provide a foundation of love, support, and encouragement, and allow the next generation to just set their own goals, and they're going to experience success and failure, as Larry mentioned, which is a good thing. It's a growth opportunity. And then they'll learn and change course and develop new goals and write their own story. So that's sort of my answer to the whole question here. I'm happy to follow up after Rina.
Okay, Rina, please.
Yeah, so I agree with both sets of comments. And also what Larry Tabak said about that trials and tribulations in life and that cause much despair and get you to question who you are and your identity are good. They shape character, they test your resilience and tenacity. Now, Asian Americans in general, and this is a very generic kind of statement, we have to be proud of our culture and our heritage. I come from this lineage of professors like Noni's that taught me the value of education, excellence, and giving back. I never forget that. I cling on to that, as I do other family traditions. But cultures can also be very, they can also be burdensome, right? And it's very often in Asian cultures that we are humble, we are always grateful, we say many more thank yous along the way. And we sometimes don't make it known that we are interested in a position, right? We work so hard, we achieve academic excellence or excellence in science, but not necessarily make it known that we seek higher positions to make a larger impact for the right reason. And we sometimes don't know what it takes to get there. And so I think it's important to know that, to navigate that path, to know that in fact, the theory of relativity that Einstein, of course, proved for physics, but I apply in life, there's always someone better than you who did far more with far less. And there are people you reach out to help who did have a lot more than you, but are unable to take that next step. And that feeling of climbing up the mountain with one hand reaching for the next level, the other hand reaching down to help someone, no matter where they come from or who they are, just to help them, is an important theory. I think that gives me personal satisfaction. And it is also, I think, a very important criteria for leaders. I feel the need for AAPI to advocate for each other, to be ambassadors for each other when positions do come up that open, that you can network and pass the news around, and serve as that community that understands our heritage and history and ancient cultures with great sense of pride. And inside each of us is that switch, right? That internal switch that you can, I know that as a woman, you experience the imposter syndrome very often. Oh, I'm not really good at this. I'm not, but it's important to switch that on. And it gives you that inner sense of confidence, not arrogance, but confidence about who you are and what you can do in this world. So I wanted to end that in my little thing with that message to all. Thank you.
Thank you, Rina. Noni, do you want to add?
Well, let me add just a couple of comments about if we're talking about leadership as a positional leadership, right? What does it take to move up in an organization? I'm somebody who came up internally within the NIH, and I guess I'll go back to what Michael was saying is rather than targeting the next position, if you care about the mission and you're looking sort of to make things better at a broader level, work toward that in the position you're in. Work toward advancing the mission in the position you're in. And you will get noticed if that happens. If you care about the mission and you understand why we're all federal employees, we work for the taxpayer. Stewardship is important, transparency is important, even if it's something we're doing wrong in our own processes. It's important to be transparent because that's the first step to fixing a problem. You can do that in any position you're in. And I think you'll get noticed. And I don't think you have to pursue the next level In fact, it's perfectly okay if you have the demeanor that the next level matters less than things getting fixed. It'll happen. Kind of what Michael was saying. So I do think it's important, if you're interested in doing more, not the next position, but in doing more, to make it known, tell people, hey, can I help with this? Especially things not just to try to get a checkbox in, but to really advance something you care about. You can tell the difference among people who are pursuing something they really care about and who are trying to get to the next position. So distinguishing that is, I think, really important.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And Noni, I would just follow up and say that before this pandemic, we used to all go to a lot of conferences. And at the beginning of my career, when I went to conferences, sometimes when the meeting ended, I'd come out of the session and I'd go back to the hotel room, go, oh, it's time to relax, or just catch up on some of my work that I didn't do. But then after I got a few years into my career, what I realized is that we do what we do by connecting with other people. And like, you can do the greatest work, but a lot of times what makes good work great is that it touches what somebody else does, or that it can take advantage of what somebody else does. And the way that you do that is that you reach out and find out what other people are doing. And throughout my career, that's something that I feel like has benefited me enormously, and it's been a huge amount of fun. That just going to these meetings and finding out how many friends that you've made there, and how the cocktail hour all of a sudden is a really fun place to go, instead of something that I would used to dread, early in my career. And I think that's a message that's not entirely, always sort of, put it this, it wasn't what my parents were raised thinking that the world would be like. And that's something that's been interesting, number one, for me to sort of realize, and number one, actually, to watch them see in their own professional careers, that I, can look at sort of in retrospect. And so I think that, there's a lot that, Rina, piggybacking on something you said, I think that one thing that's interesting is that, you learn a little bit about what the benefits of, one culture are and what the benefits of another culture are. And then it's neat to try to put them together and sort of get the best of both worlds, if you will.
Yeah. And then I Noni's comment about you do good and you get noticed. I like that, but I don't think that it just stops there, because you get noticed and you can be ignored. Or taken for granted, or compared to someone else who's making themselves more visible than you, right? So there is that subtle kind of holding back or pushback that might occur, and just be aware of it. And if it does, have those frank conversations with a mentor so that you know how best to navigate, and approach your supervisor or your boss, and take that attention that you have garnered for yourself based on your productivity, and make sure it turns into an action item that is beneficial for you. And it doesn't have to be done with aggression or with anger or anything like that, just a friendly conversation. So I would add just a little bit there to Noni's comment.
Yeah, and actually, Rina, I do agree. Of course, I mean, I think there's cases of people working really nicely, quietly, with tremendous potential, who don't get tapped, right? And that comes into the communication piece, which I think is very important. People have preconceived notions and impressions. I've experienced that. People have some notions. Some of the notions are real. Some are based on what they might have heard, and some is because of my age or gender or race or the background or whatever. But it's really important to spend the time developing and building relationships, right, in the organization you're in, outside the organization, both with mentors, with colleagues. Because I think once people get to know you, then they form opinions based on actual impressions, at least you hope so, and accurate impressions. So.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for very insightful discussion. We have only a few minutes left. Caroline, do we have any questions from the chat?
Why, hello. Yes, we do. First, I wanted to say that I received a message from someone who is watching from the United States Patent and Trademark Office, the USPTO, and I wanted to read what he said. And this is really to thank you all for doing this, is that he says that he wishes that this panel could go on forever because the speakers are awesome and 1 hour is too short. So we will definitely have to have a part 2 at some point in time. But I know we are short on time because we're ending at 4 o'clock. But we did receive a question, and I think maybe Rina can maybe try to answer this one. And these are the hard-hitting questions coming your way. So thinking about your first 100 days, what is a lesson that you've learned in your leadership position here at NIH so far?
I came in, was interviewed like Mike, and sworn in virtually, right? So you look at this glass that is half full, and you're a new director in the other part of the world. I was in Utah, and you think of ways to unite the community, and it was purely through Zooming. That was the only option we had, and to get onboarded, to understand the key players it was daunting, but it was in the end a very enjoyable experience because NIGCR is such on solid ground. Credit to Larry Tabak who created that legacy. So I had this wonderful staff that assisted me. So I would say that, of course, there were the usual challenges. We have a strategic plan underway that I had to kick off, the things that a director should be responsible for. But it was creating the sense of belonging, of community, that everyone was valuable, reaching out to those who were single and alone and who had lost family to COVID. All of that became very much part of my thinking. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We did receive another question, and I'll maybe Mike or Noni, feel free to take a stab at it. So what will be your strategy, or what is your strategy and steps you will take to encourage leadership, diversity, and inclusion at your institute?
Mike, let me do a very quick overview because I'm sure Mike has something to add. I think it has to be active. I think it has to, we are at CSR already undergoing a pretty deep analysis and getting external contractors in to help us figure out how we can change the culture, improve the culture to have more diversity in our leaders. And I think in the last year and a half, most of the promotions that have occurred at CSR have been diverse candidates, and just because they were the best candidates, they were the most qualified candidates. So I think it takes active noticing of staff who are performing well, who have tremendous potential. I'll let Michael finish up.
Okay.
Yeah, Noni and Caroline, I think that I would be prepared to give you a very political answer and just rattle off all the initiatives that we're going to do. But I think I would probably, partly in interest of time and maybe because it's more impactful, my observation has been that in organizations, when the leadership cares about something, people can tell that it makes a difference. And when the leaders go to those meetings or speak up about things or point out something that seems a little bit not the right way, my opinion is that that's the real way to make change. And I do think, I don't know if I see Larry's name over here, I'm not sure of Larry, but I think that within the NIH community, I think that we've definitely, I think that Larry and Francis who have done a really nice job of showing that this matters. And I hope that we can basically take that message and transmit it within our organizations through leadership.
Okay, now as our meeting is coming to the end, I would like to thank everyone who has joined in on the conversation, and a special thanks to Dr. Tabak and our esteemed panelists for their time and sharing their wisdom. I know that because this conversation is meaningful to me, as I take away some great lessons learned from each of you. Thank you again, and we hope you all have a great rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.